Welcome everybody to today's webinar from Konkan to Coromandel, Deccan Heritage, Art and Culture. My name is Vivek Gupta and I am one of the hosts of this webinar with Dr. Annapurna Garimella. I am from the Center of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, and Dr. Garimella is from the Art Resources and Teaching Trust in India. I'm going to kick off today by introducing our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Samana Gururaja, who completed her PhD in South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in 2021. Samana's research focuses on the filial networks among ruling families and their subordinates in early medieval South India. She now works on the ERC Dharma project based at the Humboldt-Universität, Berlin, translating and digitizing Kannada inscriptions related to the Kalyani Chalukya dynasty. Today, and we're really pleased to have Samana. If anybody has visited the Deccan region, they can't really avoid seeing these beautifully carved black schist temples of the Hoysalas. And Samana has done an excellent job researching this material and bringing it to life for us. Today, her talk is entitled Shantala Devi, the History and Mythos of an Exceptional Queen. I'm really looking forward to this lecture, and sorry about that. Look forward to question and answer after our session today, fielded by Dr. Garimella. Take it away, Sam.
Okay, I will start by sharing my screen. Okay, I'd just like to start by thanking Vivek, Annapurna, and Neil for this wonderful, wonderful opportunity and all of their help through the process. It's been a really smooth ride to get here, and I'm very excited to share my material with you all today. And thank you all so much for being here. I very much look forward to the question and answer towards the end of the talk. So without further ado, let's get started. The story of Shantala Devi is what drew me to the central questions of my PhD research on marriage and kinship in early medieval South India. I first discovered Shantala Devi on a school field trip to the famed Hoysala temples of Belur and Halebid. I had a general idea that she was a queen famed for her skill in dance, who supposedly died by suicide at a site called Shivagange, where to this day there is a precarious spot called the Shantala Drop. As I traveled around Karnataka documenting Hoysala temples for my PhD research in 2017, the story of Shantala seemed to follow me. This was the one bit of knowledge that everyone had about the Hoysala dynasty. Much to my surprise, however, the story I kept hearing was not what I had recently familiarized myself with through inscriptions and secondary scholarship, but a fictionalized account of her by a 20th century novelist, K.V. Iyer. So when I talk about the story that inspired me, I don't just mean a biographical account of Shantala Devi's life, but also the way in which her stories and the stories imagined around her have become synonymous with the Hoysala dynasty itself. In my talk today, I will touch on the mythos that these fictional narratives have woven around the figure of Shantala, but ultimately present an alternative reading of the evidence which I have gathered from my research and analysis. Everything we know about Shantala comes from stone and copperplate inscriptions of the 12th century, which primarily record the establishment and endowment of temples. These inscriptions could be commissioned by a wide variety of people and ranged from minimal records to elaborate accounts which included the genealogy of both the donor's family and the ruling family to which they declared allegiance. So here in the photograph, you have an example of a stone slab inscription, and I've just zoomed in on the text so you can really get an idea of how much information is packed into this. This is an inscription from the 13th century. And so this is one of the longer inscriptions I am talking about that would have an extremely elaborate genealogy of both the donor's family and the ruling family, as well as a record of the donation. However, inscriptions could also look very different. For example, you have hero stones, which record and memorialize the death of a warrior in battle. And these are usually much shorter inscriptions, which just record a date based on the ruler who was ruling at that time and the event which led to the hero's death. It could be as simple as just a name or artist signature on a sculpture. And then finally, to the right, you have an example of a pillar inscription where you would actually have text on all four sides of the inscription. And this inscription happens to be on the wall of the Belur temple. And it's one of the earliest Hoysala inscriptions discovered, which recorded the establishment of the Vijayanarayana temple at Belur by the king Vishnuvardhana after an important military victory at Talakad. So just to familiarize ourselves, the circle that I've drawn is the general geographical area that we're dealing with. And because the places that I look at are close together, I'm going to be zooming in on this map. So I just wanted to give you a general idea of where we are. This is Belur, where the red arrow is pointing. And this is Talakadu, where Vishnuvardhana achieved an important military victory, where he reclaimed a lot of territory that was previously in the hands of the Hoysala's southern neighbors, the Cholas. And so he reclaimed a lot of this territory of what is now the South Indian state of Karnataka and the southern part of that state. And this was in 1117 CE. It is in this inscription that Shantala first appears as the Piriyarasi, or the senior queen, and Pattamahadevi, or crowned queen of Vishnuvardhana. The inscription also contains the first formalized genealogy of the Hoysala dynasty and recorded their origin in a town called Sosevur, which is what the red arrow is pointing to right now, in the mountain region, or Malenadu, and their migration down to the plains with the rising fortunes of the family. Shantala Devi's husband, Vishnuvardhana, brought about an important turn for the Hoysala lineage, and the two ruled at a time when the Hoysala family was attempting to distinguish itself as an elite ruling family through military conquest and the commissioning of temples. The circumstances of their marriage are unclear, as they are already married by the time they appear in any inscription. The inscription at Belur contains verses which extol Vishnuvardhana's military exploits, as well as his strength and valor. And it also extols the beauty, intelligence, the devotion to her husband, and her support of the four major paths, namely Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Buddhism, and Jainism of Shantala Devi. We also get some biographical information that she was born in the city of Balipura, or Balligavi, and that her parents were named Marasingha and Machikabe in another inscription from Shravanabelgola, which I'll talk about in a minute. An almost identical description of Vishnuvardhana's military exploits and her own praise exist in the inscription which records the establishment of the Kappe Channigaraya Temple by Shantala Devi herself in the same compound as the Vijayanarayana Temple in Belur. And so this is the green little marker marks Balligavi, which is the birthplace of Shantala Devi, as noted in almost all of the inscriptions which talk about her. And as I said, the second important set of inscriptions exists at Shravanabelgola, which is an important Jain site of pilgrimage, where you have a cluster of temples on a smaller hill. And these inscriptions at Shravanabelgola establish Shantala as a lay disciple of the Jain teacher Prabhachandra Siddhanta Deva. Here, she established the Savati Gandhavarana Basadi. And we also, unfortunately, learn of her early death in 1131 through the inscriptions that memorialize her, her mother, and her teacher at this site. And so Shivagange is where she is recorded to have died. It is based on these references that several fictional works about Shantala emerged in the 20th century. So this is the earliest one that I could find. It's an advertisement for a film released in 1949 called Natya Rani. And from what I can gather, it sort of generally follows the contours of Kalidasa's Abhignana Shakuntala. And as you can imagine from the title, Natya Rani or Dancing Queen, it sort of places emphasis on the fact that Shantala was a dancer, which is a theme that you will see throughout the fictional works that narrativize her life. In K.V. Iyer's 1954 Kannada novel, Shantala, King Vishnuvardhana, preoccupied with war and statecraft, does not care to marry until his mother arranges for him to view a dance performance of Shantala and her close friend Lakshmi. He falls in love and not only marries Shantala, but several other women from her town, but he only maintains a sort of a romantic relationship with Shantala. And one of the women he marries from her town is her best friend, Lakshmi. Shantala and Vishnuvardhana enjoy several years of marital bliss, but are plagued by the fact that Shantala has not borne a male heir. Ultimately, when Vishnuvardhana refuses to consider anyone else his wife, Shantala sacrifices her life at Shivagange, and in a supernatural twist, her soul occupies Lakshmi's body, and Lakshmi then conceives Narasimha, the heir to the throne. C.K. Nagaraj's novel, Pattamahadevi Shantala, was a self-published novel by the author in 1977, after he personally discovered inscriptions that proved that Shantala had children. So this was sort of an aha moment where he was like, K.V. Iyer's reading is wrong, and this is not the reason that Shantala died. In his gigantic work of 1,800 pages, distributed across 2 volumes, he chooses to frame the central conflict as one between the war and power-hungry Vishnuvardhana and the peace-loving Shantala. As a compromise, when he does not stop waging wars, Vishnuvardhana puts Shantala in charge of work on the Belur temple. The reason for her death by suicide in this narrative is the growing distance from her husband over their incompatible beliefs. This novel was translated into Hindi in 1983, and the story of Shantala Devi became known nationally. Nagaraj even won the Murti Devi Award, which is sort of an offshoot of the Jnanapith Award, as a result. I believe that the Amar Chitrakatha, published in 1984, is based on this novel. And as you can see, though it does not center Shantala's childlessness as the central conflict, it still positions her as a self-abnegating martyr who sacrifices her life trying to pull her husband away from war and violence. And so this is the cover of the Amar Chitrakatha, which is a very popular comic book series that chronicle the lives of mythological and historical figures in Indian history. And so here's a panel from that where it sort of very dramatically captures the conflict between Shantala Devi and Vishnuvardhana, where she is very, very distraught and upset by his constant war efforts, and he doesn't understand why she's preventing him when it's bringing him all this glory. And in the end, you see her sort of appealing to Parshvanatha, who is her the deity that she is an adherent of. One second, sorry. These narratives also attempt to synthesize a vast body of disparate sources. So for example, these very stunning and well-known female figures dancing, which adorn the Belur temple, are always imagined to be capturing Shantala's own dance, even though we don't really have any evidence to support this claim. But if you go to the Belur temple, even now, the tour guides there will tell you that these figures represent Shantala Devi. And then there's another fun visual from the Amar Chitrakatha, which sort of, again, dramatizes this and imagines the sculptor thinking of Shantala Devi's dance and capturing that in his sculpture. Okay. This proclivity towards linearity is also reflected in contemporary history writing of the time, which focused on the reconstruction of dynastic chronology. Both styles of history and fiction employed a positivist reading of the panegyric or prashasti portion of inscriptions and attempted to narrow the sources down to a single authoritative chronology or narrative. Dynastic studies from the early and mid 20th century, and I'm thinking of studies such as those of Derrett and Coelho, regularly contain a separate chapter apart from the chronology on quote unquote the status of women, most often a gloss of any and all sources which mention women's activities. They typically support the notion that the ancient and early medieval periods were a sort of golden age where women had a social status and notable opportunity, if not quite equal to men, then almost there. And there's a tendency to accept the exception as the rule. So if there's an example of one woman who is patronizing construction or one woman who has a certain kind of education, it's sort of generalized to say that, you know, women could have this education or this ability to patronize structures in this period. And then this is always implicitly contrasted with the high medieval period, when the status of women purportedly suffered a decline under the rule of Muslim invaders. This implicit agenda precludes more critical questions on the access and agency of women in the undeniably patriarchal society of medieval South India, early or high. Notable exceptions to this general rule, which have sort of fueled the way I look at the sources, are more recent scholars who take sort of more of a gender kinship look at sources that are not always looked at, that are not always prioritized, and questioning the way sources have been hierarchized in the study of history. So examples include Ruby Lal's work on domesticity in the Mughal court and the work of Leslie Orr and Padma Kaimal on the prevalence of female patronage in Chora temple building. Though not explicitly connected, this kind of work follows a larger trend in the evolution of queenship studies, a subfield of European history which began in the 1970s and has moved the study of queens away from biographies of visible and exceptional queens and towards theorizations of how queens functioned as part of the larger political systems of which they were a part. So as Teresa Ehrenfeit, one of the pioneers of this field, has written in her foundational textbook, Queenship in Medieval Europe, analyzing monarchy as both kingship and queenship reveals a complex institution embedded in a patriarchal political environment that privileged rule by a king, but that could both limit a woman's range of options and propel her forward in both the personal and the political spheres. This branch of study departs from the linear study of dynasties and expands the understanding of royal households through the examination of kin networks and prosopographical information. It also expands the definition of royalty from the king's immediate family to include nobles and subordinate rulers. Drawing on this framework, I move away from the exclusive study of exceptional and visible women and examine how they function both as agents and conduits in the larger political system of which they were a part. Instead, by reading inscriptions against each other and against a larger corpus, I try to draw attention to the way in which, for example, his marriage to Shantala Devi connected Vishnuvardhana and the fledgling Hoysala dynasty to various political, religious, and artistic networks. It was in reading and analyzing a vast body of inscriptions that I discovered that the praise of Shantala was in fact quite formulaic, more elaborate than her contemporaries with some additional flourishes, but with the same general format. Praise for a woman's devotion to her husband and deity, along with praise of her beauty, were almost universal. And while the mention of prowess in dance and music is less common, it is also not exclusive to Shantala Devi. With these discoveries in mind, I began to pay closer attention to whether there was something that truly set Shantala apart from her contemporaries, or whether it was just sort of an accident that her inscriptions that detailed her life happened to be discovered at a temple that also contained many dancing sculptures, and the mention of her dancing was just conflated with those sculptures to create this narrative. And that is sort of how I feel about the way her dance became a part of her sort of personality cult. But I think there are some aspects to the way the sources describe her that actually make her exceptional and much more interesting. So if we turn to the genealogy of the Hoysala dynasty, which is I have established through reading many sources where as I mentioned, inscriptions would contain the genealogy of the rulers to which the subordinates owed allegiance. And so this is sort of the established genealogy that recurs in many of these inscriptions. And so I've put it together. And so we see that each king is only ascribed one wife. Invariably, this wife is the mother to the heir because the genealogy is being described in a very linear fashion going from father to son, and the wife is usually only described as a sort of a conduit for that reproduction of the dynasty. Inscriptions contemporary to the king's rule, however, show us that Hoysala rulers had multiple wives. But these inscriptions are almost always commissioned by the wives themselves. And so you hardly ever see any biographical, prosopographical information about these queens in the inscriptions commissioned by their husbands. It's always in inscriptions they have commissioned, or if they have subordinates that their subordinates have commissioned. And so you might recognize some names in this lineage. So Vishnuvardhana is Shantala's husband, and as you can see here, he's represented as being married only to Lakshmi Devi, who is the mother of the heir. So you can kind of see how K.V. Iyer put his narrative together based on the fact that Shantala Devi and Vishnuvardhana seemed to be such a couple who were very much together in most of the inscriptions contemporary to Vishnuvardhana until Shantala's death, but then she is not the mother of his heir, and so you can kind of see how that narrative came to be. What is extremely rare about Shantala's panegyric passages in the Belur temple foundation inscription is the fact that she is not only praised extensively, but personal details about her birth are provided in an inscription commissioned by her husband. This reflects the pivotal position she had in the rulership of the new Hoysala territory. Recognizing that she was from Balipura or Baligavi was an important enough connection for Vishnuvardhana to mark in real time. So moving on to the sort of analysis that I have done based on all the inscriptions that talk about Shantala Devi and that she commissioned herself. As I glossed before, Shantala Devi made two major architectural contributions during her lifetime. She commissioned the Savati Gandhavarana Basadi dedicated to Pashvanatha at Shravanabelgola in 1118 CE. So if you're keeping track, that's 1 year after Vishnuvardhana's major military victory and his establishment of the Vijayanarayana Temple. And the Kappe Channigaraya Temple in Belur, located in the same compound as the Vijayanarayana Temple in 1120 CE. In 1123 CE, Vishnuvardhana granted her the village of Shantigrama near present-day Hassan, where her father built a temple dedicated to the deity Dharmeshwara, who is a form of Shiva. Through this collection of records and a few inscriptions which mention her in passing, it is possible to construct the most comprehensive prosopography of any Hoysala queen. So this is a picture of the Savati Gandhavarana Basadi at Shravanabelgola. And here's a picture of the interior. So if you look really closely inside the sanctum, there is an idol or image of Pashvanatha. The 1120 inscription, which marks the establishment of the Kappe Channigaraya Temple, describes the ceremony where Vishnuvardhana tied the patta or fillet, pattamam pati kattal, on Shantala Devi in honor of her beauty and virtues, which pleased him. This gave her the title Pattamahadevi. So the idea is that it was a fillet or a cloth that was bound around the head. Therefore, as Vishnuvardhana's military successes grew more frequent, there were more resources to commit to record the imagined roles of the king and queen along with detailed praise. Vishnuvardhana's gift to Shantala of the central village Grama or Shanti Grama and several smaller villages, subsidiary villages from which collected revenue called Halli, surrounding it was possibly tied to the Patta, an honor which was generally associated with a land grant. An inscription from 1123 CE records that her father Marasingaya commissioned the Dharmeshwara temple, and he, Shantala, and Vishnuvardhana made donations to its upkeep and granted the revenue from the peripheral villages or hallis to 222 Brahmins. One of the standard epithets for Shantala Devi is Dharmeshwara Labdha Varaprasada, or the blessed offering received from Dharmeshwara, which if you manage to catch it in the quote from the Belur inscription also appears there. The use of this epithet predates the establishment of the temple at Shantigrama and points to Marasingya's adherence to the deity of the same name at Baligavi, which was Shantala's birthplace. He therefore established a new locus of worship for the deity of his preference based on his daughter's newfound position and favor with the king. In this inscription, Marasingaya is also identified with an administrative title for the first time, Heggade, which is sort of the village administrative head. Other than his adherence to the deity Dharmeshwara and the resulting connection to Baligavi, where an older Dharmeshwara temple existed, there is no information about Marasingya's descent or genealogy. However, two artisans who migrated south to Belur to work on the Vijayanarayana temple, Dasoja and his son Chavarna, were also from Baligavi. Several inscriptions at Belur called Dasoja Balligrameya Dasoja or Dasoja of Baligavi. They are also identified as devotees of Dharmeshwara, suggesting strongly that there is a connection between these sculptors and Shantala's family, which facilitated their migration south upon the marriage of Vishnuvardhana and Shantala Devi. Collier, in his extensive work on Hoysala artists, has noted that artists who worked on the temple at Belur came from a group of towns along the Tungabhadra River, namely Baligavi, Banavasi, Lakundi, and Gadag. So it seems likely that the sculptors Chavarna and Dasoja, who were from Baligavi, were connected to Shantala's family, not only through the place, but through their common worship of Dharmeshwara. It is probable that these sculptors came with Shantala's family when they migrated after her marriage. Shantala Devi died in 1131 CE at Shivagange, and despite what the novels will tell you, the inscription itself does not give us the cause of her death. It merely says that she became one who has gone to heaven. And so if there is a meaning to that I don't know, then I'm still looking for it, or if that hints at something else. But so far, I think it's just sort of a simple statement. The exact reason for her death is unknown, but it initiated a flurry of memorialization around her basti in Shravanabelgola. From these inscriptions, we learn more about her mother's side of the family, adherents of the Mula Sangha, the most prominent sect of Digambara Jainism, which is the sect of Jainism where the monks are naked. So Shantala's family were lay disciples of a teacher called Prabhachandra Siddhanta Deva, who was an ascetic in the Kunda lineage or the Kunda Kundanvaya. Shortly after Shantala's death, her mother Machikabe also took a vow of voluntary death called Pandita. In her honor, Machikabe's brother Singhimaya set up a pillar near the Savati Gandhavarana Basavi. Yet another inscription at the site records the donations of her other family members, including Machikabe's father, mother, brother, sister, and their respective spouses. Machikabe's father was Baladeva Dandanayaka. And the word Dandanayaka is sort of a general term for a military envoy. So if we assume that he was a military envoy for the Hoysalas, then it seems likely that Machika Bey was a native of Hoysala territory, sort of moved to Barligavi when she got married to Marasingaya, and then they came back when their daughter's alliance happened. Shantala Devi also bore an important connection to the network of Vishnuvardhana's subordinate through the religious affiliation of her maternal family to the Jain ascetic lineage of the scholar Kunda Kunda. Many of the inscriptions at Shravanabelagola record donations to Jain preceptors in In Shantala's family's case, Prabhachandra Siddhanta Deva, who was a disciple of Meghachandra Siddhanta Deva. Another prominent donor at the site was the subordinate who had led the victorious recapture of Talakadu in 1117 CE on Vishnuvardhana's behalf, Gangaraja. He and several of his family members erected basadis at Shravanabelagola in the name of their preceptor, Shubhachandra Siddhanta Deva, who came from the same ascetic lineage. This provides another clue to the origins of the marriage between Vishnuvardhana and Shantala Devi, possibly arranged through this religious network. And finally, there are a few passing mentions of Shantala, which also provide small insights. An early inscription from approximately 1115 CE from the Mudgere Taluk records that Shantala was traveling with her husband. In another inscription, where she is once again identified as his Piriyarasi and Pattamahadevi, that's senior queen and crowned queen, her name is mentioned in order to establish the donor's relationship with the king. The inscription says that her Maiduna, Balleya Nayaka, was ruling a town called Malige. Rice translates the term B.L. Rice, who is sort of the purveyor of the series called Epigraphia Karnatica, in which many of the inscriptions that pertain to the Hoysalas are published. He translates the term Maiduna as nephew, but I think that this is erroneous. The most common dispensation of the term is to describe the younger brother of one's husband, but it seems unlikely that this is the relationship between Balleya Nayaka and Shantala, because if he was indeed Vishnuvardhana's brother, he would not need to establish his relationship with his brother through Shantala Devi. So I think that the meaning of Maiduna is in this case is Shantala's sister's husband, which is another dispensation of the same term. Both Shantala Devi's father, Marasingaya, and her Maiduna, Balleya Nayaka, therefore cited their proximity to the king through their relationship with Shantala Devi. So she's independently, in certain ways, already connecting the king to several of his subordinates. Okay, and sort of to wrap up, I just want to say that's what I'm sort of trying to get at, that it makes it more interesting, I think, at least for me, to look at Shantala from the perspective of the networks that she is building for this fledgling Hoysala dynasty and what she is bringing into this marriage. And the fact that Hoysala kings had multiple wives seems to create an interesting relationship between the idea of queenship in the sense of rulership and queenship in the sense of mothering the male heir, which it seems could be mutually exclusive. So I just want to sort of finish this by taking a minute to think about historical fiction and the ways in which Shantala Devi's story and her mythos have sort of woven together, and what we can take away from both of them. So over the course of this talk, my intention was not anything quite so violent as busting or debunking the myths that surround Shantala. I do appreciate the place that fictionalized accounts of her life hold. Perhaps I would not have encountered her story without them. As Hilary Mantel, the author of historical fiction works such as Wolf Hall and Bringing Up the Body's Notes, it is the silences that inspire fiction around these sources and characters, and in many ways, those stories that bring new people back to the sources. And so in talking about why she chose to write historical fiction, she talks about how it was the erasures and silences that actually made her lean towards being a novelist as opposed to a traditional historian. Through my own examination of the sources around Shantala Devi, I suggest that in enjoying imagined narratives, we don't lose sight of these erasures and silences that inspire them. Reading inscriptions against each other and against a wide corpus allows for a new kind of understanding to emerge, one which tells a story about networks, households, and communities, and about the movement of people, and one which sort of undermines this very major effort that happened in the mid-20th century to make narratives very simple and neat and linear. Engaging directly with primary sources again and again allows the opportunity to once again probe these silences, perhaps allowing new kinds of stories to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samana. Would you like to stop sharing your presentation, and then we will I'll request everyone to please put forward their questions in the chat box. And if you feel like you'd like to talk, you can raise your hand. But in the interest of having as many questions as possible, I request people to put their questions in the chat box so I can bundle them. I've turned on my video. Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Samana, before other people's questions come in, let me first say thank you. It's really lovely to see your work grow and advance in these interesting ways. I have a question for you, two questions for you. One is, you began your discussion with thinking about monarchy as a combination of kingship and queenship. And certainly the discussion on queenship has really grown quite a lot. I'd like to, I know you're reading widely in the field, like from different things. What model of queenship would you like to posit, if you could, even in a few ways, in a limited way, for this period in which you're looking at? In a few succinct words, you've discussed networks, you've discussed places that come together. Using all this different data that you've presented today, if you could say succinctly, what would be a kind of a model of queenship that you're developing? Then I'll ask the second question. Okay,
that's a difficult question. To put that succinctly is difficult.
Say it more elaborately then.
Okay, well, I'll try. But I think the impulse that sort of started the exploration of this branch of scholarship was basically the need to move away from straight lines and this sort of father-son chronology that is the structure of a lot of scholarship, at least on the Hoysalas, because there hasn't been much scholarship since the early to mid 20th century about sort of the political workings of the dynasty. And so I think it's sort of questioning what the dynasty as a unit is, moving away from the idea, the embedded ideas we have about immediate family and who your closest allies are. And so moving towards, sorry, I'm stumbling. I'm going to take a minute.
Go for it.
Sort of essentially turning back to the evidence and not assuming we know what marriage means or what kingship or queenship means. The sort of decentralizing the king as sort of the figurehead of monarchy. And understanding the ways in which the king too was interacting with several intermediaries, subordinates, and sort of interacting with this incredibly complex system where in fact you could have subordinates who were tied to a particular territory for much longer than a dynasty was ruling. And they would actually assert that and sort of change the ways they engaged with the dynasty that they were declaring allegiance to. And so I think that model also is interesting for queenship, especially to think about the fact that many of these women, it's something that's sort of an earworm for me, that these women are in our line of vision. We are able to learn about them because they commissioned temples and they wrote about themselves, or they had someone write about them, and not necessarily, it wasn't a given that if you were queen, you would be sort of memorialized in this way. And so the ways in which, I don't know to what extent we can do this with the sources that are available to, but thinking about the ways in which these negotiations happened and which queens managed to actually patronize construction and have inscriptions commissioned about them in order that they're memorialized for us to access them today. Does that begin to answer your question?
Yes, I think if I can summarize what you've just said for myself, I would say that queenship is something that if we wrote the story of the Hoysalas from the queenship model, we'd get a different story. Let me summarize it that way. And that story is not necessarily against the story of Vishnuvardhana, but that it changes the whole story of the Hoysalas to incorporate much wider networks of kinship networks, geographical networks, and of course, devotional networks as well.
Right.
And of course, artistic networks. That was very interesting about your presentation. I want to also ask you another question, which is tied to the modern and the ancient part of the presentation, which is that, can you talk a little bit about the way that a term like Salekhana and suicide are coming together and don't come together in the way that the inscriptions talk about that experience of voluntary death, and the way that novelists of the 20th century talk about voluntary death as a form of suicide. So really curious. I haven't read K.V. Iyer's book, but does he use a word like Atmahatya, or does he use a word like Salekhana? I'm curious about that.
I don't remember. I will have to go back and check exactly what the word is. But the impression I get is that for the modern writers, there's this element of sacrifice and self-sacrifice, whereas in the Jain context, something like Salekhana or this ritual called Pandita, which Shantala's mother undertakes, it's a very rigorous practice, and it's sort of supervised by a guru. And so if you actually look at the inscriptions and some of the images that are depicted on the top of the inscriptions, you see a guru with a book open and then a student or a lay devotee. And so you can kind of see that this is a very supervised process where it's a gradual letting go of one's own body. And so there's a strange conflation, and I'm not sure suicide quite covers it, because of the sort of modern connotations that it has, and the connotations that it has in the novels of, you know, a certain kind of womanhood where, you know, Shantala Devi sort of puts herself second to her husband's requirements, where it's like, you know, she feels horrible that she's not able to you know, meet the requirements of being his queen and his wife. And so she, even though he doesn't want her to, she sort of undertakes this sacrificial act.
Thank you. Ujjwala Rao has put a comment in, struck by the parallels with Empress Noor Jahan kinship network, separation of chief queenship and mothering the heir, etc. Thanks for the interesting lecture. Are there any other questions from the audience that people haven't typed in? My network is a little bit slow. If anybody has questions, please raise your hand and you can say it out loud. Otherwise, I will ask another question.
Please.
Okay, I'll wait for some more.
I can ask a question.
Please, Vivek, thank you.
Samana, that material was very, very rich. I think one of the most really compelling things for me was that Shantala had these two artists or sculptors that were attached to her in some way that you've established. And I think that, you know, in future lectures, you should really foreground that a little bit, because it sounds like a major thing, but you sort of, it's not like it seems more significant than it sounds. And I wonder whether or not you have anything more to say about that. And actually, that also reminded me of Noor Jahan and others. And I wonder whether or not you can draw a line from these medieval queens to figures that are more within the Sultanate courtly world, like John Bibi, for instance, or any of these other queens and rulers. And I think that also definitely follows upon what Annapurna was saying, is can you characterize this with the model? But that might take some more time. But for now, just the artists that are attached to her is my desire to know more.
I mean, I'm almost afraid to say more, because that's really all there is in terms of what the sources are, as far as I know. And so I am able to establish the connection between her and the artists from this particular place, and establish the connection between the deity that her father establishes once he comes down south, and the deity that these artists are also adherents of back in Baligavi. I am honestly very open to suggestions about what more I could do with that, or how I could follow that as a lead, but I am sort of at a dead end with that, because I feel like that's really, I mean, I feel like I'm almost pushing it even by saying they were part of her entourage or something, because there's really no way to say that for sure.
So I would like to ask, let me just put this out there and then see what you have to say.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've done a lot of work, because I know your work beyond this seminar, this presentation, and you're reading a lot of inscriptions right now. How do you see artists emerging in the archive? Are they emerging in similar ways? As part of a retinue that may be attached to a particular queen or a king? How are you noticing that queens often bring them to their marital homes? What are you observing anything? I know you've been doing work in Lakundi, and you can talk a little bit about that too, in relationship to a second half of my question, which is that the model of queenship you present involves details like artists following, gods being worshipped, and temples being founded, religious teachers, marriages, relatives, positions in court. In all these elements, is this what queenship is? Is there any room that you see for an articulation of an individual person?
That is the wall that I keep hitting, because I feel like that is the kind of information that inscriptions provide very little of, because these are sort of public documents. And they are documents capturing a very small process in what was probably a very complex system. And so I also hesitate to sort of belabor the sources to say something they're not saying, which is where I completely understand sort of the tendency to go towards fiction, because you want to characterize these people, and you want to understand how they were feeling and why they were doing certain things that they were doing. But I don't know, I feel like that's a slippery slope, and I want to be careful to honor what the sources are actually trying to say.
So there's a fairly, right now, I know you're very preliminary in your project. Right now, there's a fairly strong wall between history writing and fiction writing. and you've kept that, I think, in order to honor a certain level of facticity and limit. It's a very beautiful gesture of humility on your part, of not overreaching, and I really appreciate that. But then there's schools of history writing, like Annales schools, when we think about the return of Martin Guerre, Natalie Zeman Davis, or someone like Carlo Ginzburg, who take, of course, granted that world had more information in terms of records and facts than you have. Can you imagine creating a historical model that is not fictional, that is not fiction, in the process of writing this sort of thing? This is a slightly different kind of question. It's a big question. You don't have to answer it, but I want to put that in front of you, because sometimes I feel that the kind of things that people do, like building a temple and having a certain kind of teacher and studying large social patterns, can become fuel for the imagination in a way which I know you're perfectly capable of. I know that. And I'd be very curious if that kind of a project interests you.
Yes, I mean, I have always loved reading historical fiction. It's something that I've, and because the historical fiction surrounding this figure is so prominent and so sort of omnipresent, it led me to thinking about this discussion of how are historical fiction and history actually different? What is the difference between the two projects there even? And what I thought was interesting in sort of thinking about this is that I realized that there's the same kind of thrust to the historical fiction and the history writing of a similar period around this dynasty, where you are definitely trying to create these very neat narratives. There's also sort of a post-colonial pushback to this idea that, you know, everything is timeless and stuff like that. So you're saying, no, you know, we have enlightened people, we have very complex societies, and so there's that element to it. And there's like several of the same concerns and desires sort of fueling the writing of both of these. And I think that's where it's really interesting to blur the lines. But I think because I'm also reacting to the fact that the overwhelming narrative that I hear, even if you casually Google Shantala Devi, the basic information that you get is K.V. Iyer's plot. And so I think because there is a part of me that's also sort of reacting to that, I am going in a little bit leaning towards the other extreme of sticking very closely to the sources. And
that's your method right now.
And I want to be able to say more. I want to be able to say especially how these women are interacting with one another. Because, for example, K.V. Iyer has, you know, Vishnuvardhana's mother being a busybody matchmaker who sees Shantala and she's like, this is the perfect wife for my son. And she's the one who sort of throws them together. And I mean, I'm sure this kind of thing is happening, but
so if we look at the work of someone like Whitney Cox, who's you know, looked at a Mekiti and other texts in the Chola world, which are not inscriptions. Do you see literature or epics or poetry that was written in the context of Shantala's life and this period as being useful for your future work as a historian, to create a mortar that can attach these bits and pieces together in a way that satisfies your desire for a richer image of a queen and a richer narrative of queenship? Do you see that being possible?
Yeah, I think that is sort of a very, very good logical next step to sort of expand the questions about at least how are people fictionalizing queens, if you want to put it that way, in that time, if not
It's a discursive quality, like,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And what, are you discovering the same things in the Kalyana Chalukya world that you are working on currently?
That's where I'm actually fascinated by this figure that you and I have been looking at called Attimabe, because she's actually closely working with a poet and
Right.
commissioning the work. And his work actually contains sort of a biography, or more like a hagiography of her life. And so I'm very interested, and she, similar to the way Shantala is positioned at the foundation of the Hoysala dynasty, she is an elite woman who's positioned at the foundation of the Kalyani Chalukya dynasty, where you have a young dynasty trying to establish itself, you have building projects happening, you have courtly texts being written, and she's sort of at the nexus of all of these things. Because her family, everybody in her family is directly subordinate to the Chalukya king. And so they're clearly like in contact. And she's also commissioning important Jain temples, and she's also commissioning this text. And this poet is then becoming the court poet of the Chalukya king. And so that's a nexus where I see some potential to sort of explore more. But in the Hoysala context, Shantala is the one I can say the most about, and I'm still so hesitant with the information that's available.
It's she's an overdetermined figure in many ways.
Right, right.
And maybe to say less is to allow her a little bit of freedom to be whatever she was, which we don't know.
Right.
That we will never know who the real Shantala was.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is time for us to wrap up. The time is coming to an end. I want to say thank you to Samana, Dr. Samana Gururaja. So thrilled to have you in this seminar. And I also want to thank Neil, who is just stellar in organizing and doing all the technological work for these seminars, connecting people from different parts of the world, and Vivek Gupta for initiating this program, which is such a beautiful program. I want to mention briefly our next talk, which is coming up on August 11th. And it's stellar topic, beautiful topic, painted chests and sculpted beds, tracing artistic connections between the Malabar coast and the broader Indian Ocean world, by Deepthi Murli of George Mason University. So it is on Friday, August 11th, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 p.m. British Standard Time, and 6:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And I see there's some really nice comments here. Before I turn it off, I want to make sure that everybody hears that Deborah Hutton has said, thank you so much for that enlightening talk. And Catherine Kasdorf, who's also a great scholar of Hoysala art. What a great lecture. Thank you, Samana, for your wonderful work. And Lee Nakbin, thank you all. Goodbye. Take care and have a lovely evening, rest of the day, wherever you are. Take care. Bye-bye.